start up like this, or like this, and hit the start button to flip back and forth. You can make the important things big, keep the small stuff small, and arrange it all around you. You can be all work, all play, or even both at the same time. You can do it all simpler and easier on your Windows tablet, PC, or Surface. That's the new Windows. One experience for everything in your life.
Hi, I'm Stacy Mulcahy. I'm a technical evangelist from New York City, and I am going to be talking about marketing your app, but in particular, application icons. Today we're going to be talking about marketing your app, but in particular, application icons. You want to do this right the first time so that you don't have to do-over on this. I'm Stacy Mulcahy, and I'm a technical evangelist with Microsoft. So the application icon is pretty much the first introduction that a user gets to what you've built, whether it be a game or an application. And it's your first introduction. It makes the first impression. And so if you think about an application icon, it's the handshake you kind of give a user. You know, this is the first introduction, first time you've met them. You want to make sure that you're giving them a really good handshake. So you don't want any of that limp kind of fish handshakes. You want to make sure it's strong, that they remember you, that they look you in the eye. And so when we're thinking about icons, icons are one of those things that, you know, make that first impression. And we're going to go over just a little bit of theory about icons, whether it be, you know, how you make them, what works, what doesn't. We're going to talk a little bit about colors, and we're going to talk about just how you can actually make your own application icon. And so if we're looking at something like, you know, icons, we can go back to Scott McCloud, who wrote this really great book called Understanding Comics. And yeah, okay, it sounds a little fluffy, understanding comics, but there is so much great information about icons and just design in general, just even copywriting from this book that it's a must, absolutely a must read for most people. And so in his book, Understanding Comics, he talks a little bit about the idea of cognitive load. And it's kind of how much can your brain handle? And so if we're looking at something like on the, you know, on the screen here, and it's the idea of realism in icons. And so a lot of times, you know, super realism in icons doesn't really work to your benefit. And the reason is because when you're looking at these things, you know, you're saying, oh, it's super realistic. I see it. That is a Nokia XXX camera. That is a Canon camera, whatever it may be. And, you know, it becomes something very, very specific. Yet your application itself might not be something very specific. You might just have a camera taking app, you know, so you want to abstract that out a little bit. And so, you know, you want to look for icons, as he's kind of laid out here, that describe. And so something on the left, when you look at it, it's a person, it's super realistic. You know, and you can relate and see who it is. And it's definitely most often not you, but, you know, as soon as you start to abstract those things out and there's less detail, but there's enough detail that you can kind of interpret it, you know, you can start to relate to a little bit more. And so if you're looking at something, you know, in the example with the icons, you know, touch me, take a picture, and the other one, you know, that simple little camera icon, you know, most people can understand it. They can look at it, make the, you know, connection right away. It doesn't take a lot of time, and yet it's not too descriptive. It's not, you know, too defined, which is good. If you look at the one on the right, that's definitely a point-and-shoot camera. You know, it could be something like a Canon model, and it all of a sudden you look at it and you're like, oh, like what am I doing there? I'm not even on a Canon. I'm on my iPhone or my Windows phone or my, you know, my Android, my Nexus, whatever. Why would I have this icon? And so this is kind of the reason why you've seen icons the way that they are right now, where they're being a little bit more abstracted out. And so if you look at something like this on the left, you see this icon that's very defined, super, you know, realistic, you know, down to the shadowing and everything, all the way to the right. So there's this whole progression of less detail, less detail, less detail. And you're starting to see like icons with, you know, less detail work better in most UIs. And that's because you can look at the one on the right and it can be any camera. But if you look at the one on the far left, that's a very specific camera, which means that there's a very specific task related to it. When it comes to realism, realistic icons, there's nothing wrong with it. But you've got to watch for hyperrealism, and you kind of, sometimes we'll see icons get into that uncanny valley. And uncanny valley is that term that refers to something that is it's almost so real, almost so human, for example, yet there's something about it that's just off, and you can't figure it out why, and it's just a little off-putting, and it becomes one of those things where you get repulsed by it. And not necessarily repulsed in that horrible kind of way, it just kind of sets you off. And so when you're looking at those kind of things, there should be human likeness, so like that icon that we saw previously, but it's almost super hyper-realistic that you get put off by it. And so you start to see this whole kind of, human likeness versus familiarity, and where you as a person can resolve that. And so I took a couple of pictures on the right of examples of things that a lot of people would consider uncanny valley, but you start to see you look at these images and they're so, realistic, but there's also something off-putting about it. So understanding colors when it comes to icons is a pretty important thing, and you'll start to see that there's been a lot of trends when it comes to understanding colors. So we're going to go through a little bit of color theory. So if we're looking at color theory, colors can help, I guess, evoke a bit of, emotion or reaction from you. And there is a whole, science behind this or psychology behind it, and you can read into it. But if we're looking at just, the basic kind of colors you might see, if you're looking at yellow's, optimistic and creative and warmth and energy. You often see, yellow maybe being painted in a kitchen, for example. Yellow is one of those things that sometimes people paint their baby's nursery. And once again, maybe that's not the best choice. Maybe they should have something that's a little bit more soothing and downplayed. So then you look at something like orange, and orange is one of those colors that's very call to action. Anytime there's a call to action, especially on a website, you'll often see orange being used. And so it's, anticipation and cheerful, it's alert, it's confidence. It's that kind of amazing medium between yellow and red. When you get to red, red's all about stimulation, and it could be stimulation of appetite, of action, any of those kind of things. It sometimes, evokes a sense of danger or alertness, right? Bold, it's very bold and excitement. So often you'll go into a store and signs, sale signs are in red because they're trying to stimulate you to do something. They're trying to, show excitement. When you look at something that's pink, pink's often not used. Obviously, it's targeted mostly towards women or young girls. So, you think about Barbie or you think about Victoria's Secret, and it's romantic, it's feminine. And so pink often, has those kind of connotations. But, sometimes you'll see it in other logos. You'll see it in other places like Taco Bell has pink in it, for example. You go to purple, and purple is one of those colors that it's pretty interesting because most men do not, if you're looking at gender, most men do not like purple. Women tend to like purple. And purple is one of those colors that has, creativity and its imagination, often associated with royalty, right? So when you think about what royalty would wear, often purple comes to mind. It's been known to be wise, sometimes soothing. You look at blue, blue's everywhere. There's a gazillion shades of blue out there right now. Everyone and their dog is using blue in their logo. You can think about every single startup in the last probably 2 years, and 75% of them have been using blue. And blue is one of those colors, it's dependable, trust, security, it's all of those kind of things that you want people to feel. And so often when it comes to blue, you'll see a lot of banks use it. You'll see a lot of, technology companies using blue. So blue is one of those, colors that's very well used across the board. Greens often evokes health. It evokes nature, growth, peacefulness, right? So green is one of those things that you'll see often in sometimes in healthcare. You'll see it places like that. nature, they tend to use green. If you're looking at something that's kind of gray or whitish, in that kind of realm, you're looking at balance and calm. You're looking at something that's, well kind of organized, and there's a bunch of stuff that falls within the gray. And if you're looking at black, black is almost always about sophistication, the little black dress, if you want to think about it that way, or that black sports car. It's luxury, it's power. Right? So luxury brands tend to, use black. So you're looking at something like, Chanel, for example, any of those kind of big luxury brands that suggest that you're going to be spending a lot of money. They tend to use black. So if we're looking at red, and red's that sense of stimulation, take a look at all the logos here and all the fast food. It's amazing when you look for fast food and logos and you see how much red is everywhere. Often it's different shades of red, but if you look at across the board, you'll see that there's a lot of red. A lot of people, in terms of their restaurants, will paint a certain wall or an accent wall red. They'll use red to kind of, excitement, stimulation. The idea that maybe if my logo's red and you come into my restaurant and there's a red wall, you might spend more, buy more, eat more, whatever it may be. If you look at something like blue across the board, you've got so many verticals covered here, and yet blue has been used, and there's so many shades of blue. So the one thing that's important to note about blue, and especially green, is that there's way more color variations that our eyes can detect than a lot of the other colors. And so that's often why you'll see a lot of people using blue and green, just because there's so many shades. And right now there's just a gazillion shades being used, and they're all just a little bit different. If you look at this, they're all just a little bit different, but we all can say that they're blue. And the same thing for green. The other reason why a lot of people use blue and sometimes green is because that is the one color that both genders, generally agree on liking. We both can say, yeah, blue's okay. Like, I can handle blue. Blue's not bad. And so, if we can't have pink and we can't have purple, we'll take blue. And blue is one of those colors that, both genders kind of agree on. And so you'll start to see blue being used across the board. So, when you think about your logos, you've thought about a little bit, you thought about the colors, and you thought about, like, do I go realistic? Do I go abstract? You got to also consider your placement. And this is one thing that a lot of people don't do. And so when you're building an app, and let's say you're building a to-do app in some kind of task manager, you need to go and look at the ecosystems that you're going to be deploying that app in, and even take a snapshot of, let's say you search for a to-do app, take a snapshot of what the App Store brings you back, whichever App Store you're in, and then superimpose your logo in one of those places and see if it stands out, or see if it blends in, or consider its placement overall. And a lot of people forget about this. They kind of design things in a silo. They don't think about where it's going to be placed. And so, you'll often see like a sea of blue, or when you could just change that shade of blue just a little bit. So instead of blue, maybe you can use teal, right? So you've got to consider the placement. And so, I did this example where I was looking at a calculator app, and I went into the Android store, Google Play, and I looked at all the icons, and you start to see a couple of things. And so I did this in all of the app stores, and you start to see, okay, so there's some icons that are super realistic. There are some icons that are more abstract, right? There are a lot of blue, there's a lot of gray, and there's also kind of, almost a lot of black here. And so, those kind of things start to, bring all that stuff together for you a little bit. And, you start to look at how highly rated things are, where their placement is, etc. Go in, read the reviews, but their icon really does tell you a lot about, how successful they're being. I did the same thing. Once again, looked for a calculator. And right here, you see a lot of gray, you see a lot of black, and once again, you see a lot of blue. And so, you can start to see what's going to happen. Now, some of these are a little bit more realistic than others. And, realism is one of those things in an icon that it really depends on the app store that you're submitting to. You want to kind of adhere within what their aesthetics are. So when you're looking at something like this, older iOS was very skeuomorphic, and it really, wanted the hyper-realism And they're doing a shift now away from that, especially with iOS 7. But, you look at something like the Microsoft Store, it's very much about flat icons, no shadows, all the principles of flat design. Once again, I looked at the calculator in the Windows Store, and you start to see blue, gray, and black. So across the board, we've seen the blue, gray, and black are kind of what they are. And all these icons are kind of, not very realistic. You got someone here with a boat, calculator, I'm in a boat, I'm just going to pull out my calculator. But once again, like, you can take a look at all these things and kind of figure out where do you want to place yours. So, you have people here with almost always using the same shades of gray and the same shades of blue. There's an opportunity here for you to create a simple icon and use a different color. And if you want to go blue, that's fine. But, you could go a lighter shade of blue here, or maybe a more aggressive shade of blue that's, more towards teal. Maybe you can go green. You got to start thinking about the placement. So when it comes to icon design, it's something that a lot of developers struggle with, and no wonder. Icon design is not an easy thing. There are icon designers out there, and they get paid a fortune. Logo designers get paid a fortune, and there's a reason why. Creating a really good logo is invaluable. It's the connection that a user can make with a product without having any words half the time. And so when it comes to, icon design, a lot of people struggle with it. It's not easy, and it's not just about not knowing the tools. It's also, about that process, about creating something that really speaks for itself and kind of gives the user a sense of, what your application or game is doing. And so, people struggle with it, and it's hard. There's really no good answer for, how you do icon design. But when you're thinking about icon design, you need to consider a couple of options, and there are options for you. You can consider doing it yourself, and so that means that you're going to pick up some kind of graphics program. So you might use Illustrator, you might use Photoshop, and you might, try playing around and even MS Paint and do it yourself. The thing about doing it yourself that you need to realize is that in icon design is that you always want to start at the biggest size icon that you're going to need, and then you're going to want to scale down for the other sizes. And when you scale down, you don't just resize and call it a day. That's just the lazy way to do it. And what happens often is if your icon has a lot of fidelity and a lot of fine lines and things like that, when you size down, it's going to lose that because you're doing it proportionally. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to create your icon in its biggest size, and then when you size down, you're going to want to go in and kind of touch it up and fix where you need to. So the idea that you can make one icon and just size it down for everywhere doesn't result in really great quality icons. So you can do it yourself. You can also get a quick start with icon fonts and kits. And so a lot of people out there, there's like the Noun Project, there's all sorts of sites devoted to just icon fonts. Sometimes you have to pay 99 cents to, get that little icon. Most of them are free. And this is a really good place to start. You could just use the icon as is, or you could use the icon, bring it into something like Illustrator, break it apart and tweak it and do whatever you want to do and add on to it and make it your own. But they give you a really good quick start. So once again, you can look for icon, fonts and kits at a very minimal cost. Consider making friends with a designer. Scary sometimes, right? But those people in the turtlenecks with the black rimmed glasses and the big beards are friendly. They just want to help you, and also they love to give creative input. And so even if you have something to start with that's not where you want to be, but it's something that you feel like you've done and it evokes what it is, but you need it better, make friends with a designer and get their creative input, and often they'll help you. You can hire a freelancer. If you're going to hire a freelancer to do your icon, you need to consider how much you want to pay, and you need to consider giving them some parameters. The worst thing you can do to a designer is basically say, well, I'm building an app and it's all about watering your plants, and I have no idea, maybe it should be green. Like, you need to give them definite parameters, and you need to give them reference. And so often, if you're going to work with a designer, go and look and pick out, 10, 15 icons that you really like. go and pick out 10, 15, icons. And once again, this applies to design as well. But go and pick out 10, 15 things you don't like. Choose 5, 6, 10 words that you feel should be words that could be associated with your application or game, right? So maybe it's fun, maybe it's trustworthy, maybe it's explosive, whatever you might be creating. But, create this kind of abstract vocabulary around what you want is what you need to do for a designer. Giving them reference is always a good idea, getting some words. Even if you sketch out something that you kind of like, or you have a reference of something, that really helps the designer as a starting point. You want to give them the freedom and creativity to go and run on their own, because they will, and that's what they excel at. But you also want to give them those parameters of it needs to be like this, or this. Also, if you're building an app, give them the one-line mantra for your app. My app does this, or your elevator pitch. And so that they have those words always in mind when they're designing. You can also crowdsource design, and so there's a lot of crowdsourcing sites for design. Basically what you do is you kind of put up a creative brief, which is like, I'm looking for an icon, it should be like this, I need it in these sizes, here's all my reference, here's all my background to it, and people will bid on it. Now, once again, like hiring anyone and someone that you're not working with, kind of side by side, there might be some problems there. You might have good results, you might have questionable results. Crowdsourcing design is one of those things that it's become a trend lately. I don't know if I would necessarily endorse it 100%, but it's there. It's an option, and it's something that you can consider. And so, once again, you just have to be prepared and have a bit of a creative brief before you go into it. But you can start to, work with someone and start to see something, come back. You want to make sure, though, when you're crowdsourcing design or even hiring a freelancer, that you start to look at their work so that you have an understanding of their aesthetic and what they've done in the past, so that you know that it's a good fit for what you're looking for. Because you don't want to hire someone who does a lot of 3D art and a lot of, whatever kind of look it may be, illustration, when that's not what you're looking for. You want something that fits within the style of what you're looking for. And that's all I got about, starting to do your icon design. It's definitely one of the most important things you can consider, and so you need to consider all the psychology behind it, you need to consider the design behind it, and you need to consider the placement. And so taking those into consideration, hopefully, you can go out there, create some icons, and not have to worry about constantly going back and revisiting them. Thank you.